So this evening, we will focus our discussion on gut health and nutrition, specifically looking at the microbiome. My name is Ashley Holden, and I will be your host this evening. Next slide. So this is a quick overview of our program for this evening. So I will be sharing more about the Lupus Foundation of America, some helpful resources and ways that you can get involved. We are also so excited and honored to have our speakers this evening, and we'll go into their topics a little bit more when we get to them. But we do have Dr. Silverman, Dr. Geraldino Pardilla, and Ayana Dookie with us this evening. Next slide. I'd also like to give a special thank you to our presenting sponsor for this evening's event, which is Aurinia. Next. So before we begin, I do have a few housekeeping items to go over. So if at any time you have a general question that you would like to submit to our speakers, you can send it through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Just click on it and type in your question. If you would like to submit your question without providing your name, there should be an option to remain anonymous when you submit that. There should be a checkbox there. We do have time allotted at the end where our speakers will have time to answer those submitted questions from the audience. If you do have questions that are more specific to your specific situation, maybe not quite as general, we also have our health education specialists, and you can reach out to them through our website at lupus.org/healtheducator. Tonight, we will also have a couple of opportunities for you to interact with us and each other. So throughout the program, we have a couple of polls, and then you can also connect with each other via the chat. I feel like we're all pretty savvy in Zoom these days. And then finally, as you may have noticed, this program will be recorded, and you'll receive a link of the recording along with helpful resources, a post-event survey where you can submit feedback about tonight's program. And if you stay tuned till the end of tonight's program, you will see that we do have a raffle item, and that will be given away to those that complete that survey. So our next slide. And we have our first poll. So we'll go ahead and launch that. Okay, so the first question we have is, are you familiar with the term microbiome? And the choices are yes, no, somewhat, or I've heard the word, but I'm not sure what it means. And so we'll give us about 30 to 45 seconds to answer that poll question. Go ahead and just take a couple more seconds to finish the poll. Great, and we can go ahead and close out the poll and look at those, the results. Okay, so it looks like 42% of people that responded said yes, they're familiar with the term. 20% said no. 22% said somewhat, and 16% of you that responded said you've heard the word, but you're not completely sure what it means. Great. We can go to the next slide. So before we get to our speakers this evening, I just wanted to share a little bit about the Lupus Foundation of America. And so this is our vision and our mission. And really, we work to meet the diverse needs of all people with lupus. Our commitment has never wavered in our more than 40 years of service. Today, people with lupus are living longer, healthier lives than ever before, and the Lupus Foundation of America has played a significant role in that achievement. We remain resolved to doing everything we can to help you navigate the complexities of lupus while rallying every possible resource to end it forever. To put this simply, our goal is to one day end the impact of lupus and its suffering, while ensuring that we provide the comprehensive support and programs that people with lupus need today. We can go to the next slide. So I mentioned those programs that we know that people with lupus need today. And so our programs stand upon three different pillars, and those are research, care and support for people affected by lupus, and advocacy. So we have redefined lupus research to expand our efforts beyond just funding research grants. We are engaging all stakeholders to identify barriers that stand in the way of progress and setting course to overcome them. And we do this while providing caring support for people affected by this devastating disease and leading advocacy efforts to bring more funding for research and services. Next slide. So we do have a comprehensive approach, and it's focused on achieving meaningful results that will make a difference in the people of lives affected by lupus. So we align our efforts and resources towards achieving 4 specific outcomes. So we want to improve early diagnosis of lupus, securing new, safe, effective, and tolerable treatments for people for lupus. And then we want to expand the direct services and increase access to treatments and care. And then also raising money and securing government funding to operate programs and help people affected by lupus. Next. Our research is also patient-centered. We know that you should be at the center of everything that we do, and we really want to be focused on transforming lives. So we have 3 goals: identifying the causes of lupus, discovering better ways to control symptoms, and ultimately find pathways to cure lupus. So we seek to deliver the most significant impact on people's lives in the shortest time possible. So we know that in order to do this, we have to attack lupus from every direction possible. Next slide. So I'd like to highlight some of our programs and services that we do have available to the community. We can go to the next slide. So first, we want you to know that you're not alone in this journey. You can find local support and connect to others in the community. Of course, the national office is also available for you, but we do have that network of chapters and regional offices that offer local programming support and events. You can visit lupus.org/chapters to get connected and find support local to you. Next slide. I'm always super excited to talk about this. This is SELF, and SELF stands for Strategies to Embrace Living with Lupus Fearlessly. And it's our new free online self-management program, really to help people with lupus live their best life. And so it's a virtual coach that can help you manage lupus symptoms, manage stress, manage your medications, work with your healthcare team. It's convenient and customized to your needs. It offers easy to use tools, trackers, information, support, and reminders. So please, if you haven't done so, make sure you check out lupus.org/self, and you can get more information and sign up for that self-management program. Next. So I mentioned one of our pillars is advocacy. And so we do have our 2022 Digital Lupus Advocacy coming up. And so that is the nation's largest lupus advocacy event. And so it's going to be held virtually again this year from June 27th to 29th. And you can join thousands of your fellow lupus advocates in an immersive, experiential, online environment to learn about the latest lupus research, connect with other advocates, and advocate for policies to improve the lives of people affected by lupus. If you haven't already done so, you can register for this digital event. You can visit lupus.org/summit and get registered for that exciting event coming up. It's not too far away. Next. We are also excited to welcome our Walk to End Lupus Now events back in person this year. So getting involved in a walk is easy. You can visit lupus.org/walk-to-end-lupus-now to find a walk near you. You register, start fundraising, and then finally spread the word and invite your family, your friends to join your team. If you're more comfortable doing this from the comfort of your own home, we will also be offering a virtual walk as well this year. Next slide. Finally, here's some more information on how you can reach us and also follow us on social media, which is a great way to stay updated on all of our programs, events, and services that I've mentioned tonight. We have a lot of other programs and services that I did not mention this evening, just in the essence of time, so I can make sure we get to the bulk of the content for this evening. But if you haven't done so, I encourage you to check our website and look at those programs and services. I also want to mention that we do have those health education specialists I briefly mentioned earlier that are able to provide people with lupus, their families, caregivers with non-medical counseling, disease education, and helpful resources. So they can help you find trustworthy information to answer your questions about lupus and how to cope with it. Again, you can contact a health educator at lupus.org/health educator. We also have 2 bilingual health educators available that speak Spanish. So keep that in your back pocket if you ever meet somebody that might need some information, or if they speak Spanish and are looking for information as well. We can go to our next slide. Okay, so we have one more poll question today, and we can go ahead and launch that. Okay, so the next poll question is, do you make food choices based on how it could impact your lupus? And the options here are yes, no, sometimes, or I'm not sure. Again, we'll take about 30 seconds to answer this poll question. Okay, go ahead and take about 5 more seconds to finish the poll. We can go ahead and close the poll and take a look at those results. Okay, so 40% say yes, you do make food choices based on how it could impact your lupus. 17% says no. 34% say sometimes, and 8% say not sure. Great. Okay, so we can go to the next slide. So our first presentation is Dr. Greg Silverman, and he is a professor of medicine and pathology and endowed Bops Chair of Medicine, Associate Director of the Division of Rheumatology, Director of the Laboratory B-Cell Immunobiology at the NYU Grossman School of Medicine, and Master of American College of Rheumatology. After completing clinical training in internal medicine at UCSD, he was a fellow at the Scripps Research Institute in Rheumatology and Clinical Immunology, with research training in molecular immunology with a focus on the structural basis of immune recognition. Work in his lab is highly translational, and he has authored over 160 publications. His group is focused on understanding autoimmune pathogenesis and the roles of the gut microbiome. So as you can see, he has quite an impressive resume. And Dr. Silverman, when you're ready, please go ahead and unmute yourself, and you can take the floor away and turn your camera on.
Okay. Hopefully you can see and hear me. Thank you so much, Ashley. I really enjoyed your presentation. And I have to say that I may be biased, but I particularly like that you included a slide with hugs. So I think that that's really nice. Next slide, please. So I love starting my talk with this image because it's very evocative. And it was taken from the cover of Science, and I didn't compose it. But it's an image of a young woman who is contemplating a version of herself that's composed of many different microbes. And that's really the topic of today's discussion. What it also means to me is it reminds me of probably 2 decades ago, I had a patient that I was taking care of. And despite my best efforts, her lupus progressed and she developed very severe disease. But we were just chatting one day and she told me something I found really remarkable. She told me that she had an identical twin sister who had no problems at all health-wise, and that no immunologic disease, and she was quite healthy and well. And I actually spent about 1.5 years comparing their immune systems and learning quite a bit about it. But if nothing else, it proves that life is not fair, It also illustrates that there's been much effort and much that we've learned about the genetic predisposing factors to lupus. And there are over 120 different genetic factors that if you inherit them may give you a little bit of an increased risk, but altogether they only represent 30% of the contribution for developing lupus. So what's with that? What's the rest of it? Why was this young woman affected by lupus, but her sister was not? And I spent a long time thinking about it. And in part, that's why I composed this talk. Next slide. So the idea is, truthfully, that we are not alone. And this is not a science fiction introduction. It's just the fact that we are not sterile. And every surface that we have on the outside and the inside, and people even argue about places deep within our bodies, are colonized by bacteria. Not all bacteria are bad. In fact, only a minority are. And we co-evolved with these bacteria, and we need them for life. And if we didn't have them, we would actually not do very well and probably not survive very long at all. And the idea is that there are many factors that influence which bacteria are within our bodies. And the largest community, as we'll talk about, is actually in our intestines. But they're really in our airways, every surface that we have, from our bladders to our toes. And it's influenced by the genetics that we have, that we inherit, the environmental factors that we'll discuss, diet that we're going to talk about briefly, lifestyle, hormones, and even the impact of our industry that now creates the food that we eat. And examples are communities that live in our noses, within our mouths, our lungs, our stomachs, our colon, and our sexual organs and our skin. And all of these actually influence different aspects of the rest of our body, our physiology, and whether or not we'll be healthy or whether or not we have a weakened state that will make us susceptible to different kinds of infections and inflammatory diseases and autoimmune diseases. Next slide. So the topic of the microbiome, or the small communities that we have within us, on us, is only about 20 some odd years old. And I have to say, if you think about Louis Pasteur, and he introduced us to the idea that microbes contribute to disease, that was all based truthfully on culturing different bacteria and studying them very closely. And it really was with the development of polymerase chain reaction based analysis that we can actually take little samples of body fluids or tissue, and we can actually investigate what bacteria are present without having to grow them, which biases them. So, from an egghead kind of a perspective, we now know that there are about 5,000 different species at different parts of our body. And these communities are somewhat different between us, individuals in our own communities, and in different parts of the world. And that we've divided them into different groupings, which is not that important to go into, in phyla, and each of them actually have very different kinds of metabolic capacities. And now we're sequencing down to the last gene what's present. And the important point is that amongst these 5,000 species are over 300 million genes. And I'm saying that because it's quite fascinating. How many genes does a human being have? And when they solved the first genome, and that was only something like 15 years ago, they were astonished to find that human beings only have 20,000 genes. But the bacteria that live within us have so many more genes, and actually that contributes to a tremendous range of different capacities and metabolisms. And we're actually learning how little we know as well. And we can't grow all of these bacteria, we can't study them, we don't really understand what all of them do. And then you put them together into these complex communities, and really, what is going on? Well, we're just trying to find out that now. Next slide. So this just makes it very simple. And this just speaks to, in fact, different parts of our body, oral cavity versus in our intestines and other places, what bacteria are most prominent, and some major species that we've all heard of. Streptococci, a very small number of those are responsible for strep infections. And we may well encounter Corynebacterium on our skin. And this just speaks to the diversity of different communities that are present in different places. It's just an overwhelming slide. It's just to show you that it's really quite complicated if you stare too closely. Next slide. So the point is that we really are the home of a zoo. And I have to say, I like science fiction, and I always find this fascinating because we are not alone. We are actually composite organisms. And actually, there may be more microbial cells than human cells that we're carrying around. And the important point is that there's so many more genes that are involved in these microbes, and they can shift communities, and they can actually change what these communities want to do at different sites. And that's the idea that, you can go watch the X-Men, and they'll talk about mutations in humans and some powers that they actually acquire. But the point is that our communities within us can shift so dramatically and really change what they're doing. And just think about it. I once saw a presentation from a postdoc, and he actually took a stool culture and analyzed it every week, once a week. And he looked at how these communities were shifting over time. And then he showed actually what happened one week where he actually got influenza and the bacteria shifted dramatically. And then another time when he went on a trip to Southeast Asia, and the diet that he was ingesting changed the community itself. And it was adapting. In part, it was adapting to the inflammation of the viral infection, and it was adapting to the nutritional opportunities that were present in the different kinds of food that he was eating. It's really quite remarkable. But also what's really quite remarkable is that we need our intestinal or gut microbiome to develop our immune system, or it would not be developed at all. Let me just show you another slide. Next, please. So the idea is that we emerge from the more or less sterile womb, and the contents of our intestine are kind of sterile. There's nothing going on in there, and they're really not supposed to have a lot of bacteria. People debate it within the womb or the uterus. But as soon as you're born, you're immersed in this dirty world. And from one place or another, your intestine becomes colonized, so does your skin, so does every part of you. And there's actually a sequence that occurs over time. What this seeks to show is this is lumen, this is the inside of your intestine, and you really only have some cells that are like stem cells. They're waiting to be stimulated, but they're doing nothing. And they really need to be colonized. And if it's in your intestine, it's probably from mom, to tell you the truth. And all deliveries are a little bit contaminated, and this is where the bacteria comes from. And in fact, it's good. It's necessary because it starts to pump up your immune system. And actually, I like to write in my reviews, they're like sparring partners, kind of puny ones to start out with, but they tell the immune system, wake up, let's get some more immune cells, let's get ready for the real threats. So pathogenic bacteria, inherently, these are bacteria that will invade our tissues and cause injury. But our commensal communities, they live with us. They're symbiotic, they're helpful, and they can actually initiate protective responses. But if you it may have to do you're predisposed because of genetics or because you have injury to some tissue. These imbalances can occur. And in fact, this may contribute to progressive changes that result in inflammatory and autoimmune diseases we'll discuss. Next slide, please. All right, so what do these bacteria do? At a minimum, they're very helpful. They actually synthesize vitamins that our cells can't make. So our cells, we would all be very weakened and die. They help break down the food that we eat, like carbohydrates. They turn it into these mediators that help slow down inflammation. They actually pump up immune cells, and they actually reduce inflammation through induction of cells that are really meant to dampen excessive responses. They're kind of like the graphite rods in the reactor. And I've written grants where I've asked the question, we always wonder about the environmental influences that contribute to the development of lupus. I would actually say we have good evidence to suggest that our intestinal microbiome is the strongest environmental influence. It's the internal influence that actually contributes to health or can get into a feed-forward cascade contributing to lupus. Next slide. So these are just examples where there's many good bacteria and they keep balance and they do these functions that I just were talking about. Bifidobacteria actually break down the carbohydrates in mother's milk, and actually is an example how we evolved to actually be breastfed. And we have bacteria within us that are going to be anti-inflammatory and actually set up our immune systems for life if we get the right nutrition. E. coli are not all bad. Only a few of them actually will contribute to infections. And this is too much of a bad strain in the wrong place, but they actually make vitamins. Lactobacillus is another example of something that can boost immunity and protect against carcinogens. These other bugs on the right side, and they can all coexist in the same intestine, but in the right balance. Small amounts of Campylobacter is not bad. When it gets overgrown, it causes a very inflammatory kinds of bowel injury and diarrhea. Clostridia difficile, which we'll talk about in a minute, is an anaerobe, which causes a lot of disease. Why does it cause a lot of disease? It's because of excessive antibiotics in most cases, and I'll tell you more about that. And enterococcus also can be important. It should live in your intestine and should not contaminate your surgical wounds. Next slide. So I love showing this slide because I was very impressed when I saw this. A good friend of mine, Marty Blazer, likes to explain this idea of this hygiene hypothesis. Why do we have such inflammatory disease? And it's because our immune system, he says, out of balance. He says, explains that we're in this hyper-hygienic world, the Western society, and so affluent, and so many infections we rarely get, and they are actually relatively unusual. Rheumatic fever is less common, although I have a friend in the hospital from rheumatic heart disease today. Measles is less common, but there are outbreaks every now and then. Hepatitis A is not as common in our communities. And tuberculosis, we are in a low tuberculosis society. But you see, all of these are going down, and the point is, we wonder whether or not we evolved to be exposed to these things, and we need them to pump up our immune systems so the immune system might not drift towards attacking ourselves. And then to show this slide at the right, which really seems as though it's connected, shows this epidemic of autoimmune diseases that are just increasing more and more and more. More than 6% of Americans now have an autoimmune disease, whether it's multiple sclerosis, Crohn's disease, diabetes, or asthma. And my colleague would show this and say, look, we don't really have the right kind of balance because our immune system just isn't stimulated enough in the right way. That's what autoimmunity comes from. But this is not necessarily true. We have a saying, correlation is not necessarily causation. So I think that this is misleading. Next slide. So Marty wrote this book. It's really fun. You can get it online, or you can get it in any bookstore that is about the missing microbes. So they studied the intestinal bacteria that are in native populations in New Guinea, where no Westerners have ever gone there. They're not corrupted by all the food that we eat. And actually they find bacteria in these hunters and gatherers that we don't have anymore. And they say, we used to have them. I mean, when we lived in a more primitive life, and that our hyperhygienic society is contributing to a loss of bacteria. And it's also all of the antibiotics that we're given. And I forget what the number is, but it was previously estimated on the order of 50 courses of oral antibiotics that a child gets before age 10. Just drown kids in antibiotics because it gets rid of the pathogenic bacteria. But maybe that's not all it does. The question is whether it weakens the good bacteria and actually sets you up to have an imbalance. Next slide. All right, so what is really the threat? So the antibiotics may be a problem, but that correlation, inverse correlation, I think that there's increasing evidence that what's actually happened is we are being attacked by the food that we eat, hidden dangers in every bite. And I made that up last night. I think it's great. But, and the point is, now teenagers in the United States, it's estimated that 70% of all the food they eat is processed. What does processed mean? It means it comes out of a factory. If there's more than one ingredient on that package or 5 ingredients, you're in trouble. And what are these ingredients? They're actually food additives that the federal government allows. Now there are over 300 additives that are permitted by regulatory authorities to be added to our food, to make them more colorful, to make them have a better texture, seemingly to make them taste better, or just because we're used to it, I have to say. And the point is that they aren't really individually tested. What are the criteria for approval is it has previously been approved. So now that we have better testing and better models and understand the science, nobody has to go back and reevaluate. And there are some studies that are now being reported that things that we eat on a very regular basis are actually bad for us. If you give Splenda to a mouse, it actually starts to get changes in its intestine that looks like Crohn's disease. That's not a great idea. And overgrowth with bad bacteria from food additives like sulfites that are preservatives and P50 food emulsifiers, whatever that is. I have to say, you have to wonder about this. People didn't really think about the bacteria within us and on us. But we buy this processed food that's sealed in these containers that we can put on a shelf in our pantries. And the stuff looks exactly the same 5 years later. Why? Because the food itself, it can't be digested by the microbes in our environment. So you say it's not compatible with life as we know it. Why are we eating that? So I have to say, if nothing else, you should figure out where on the YouTube, they have this apocryphal tale of the Big Mac, where somebody took a picture of a Big Mac that they bought at McDonald's, a picture a day for an entire year. And you know what the Big Mac looked like at the end of the year? It looked like a Big Mac. It didn't change at all. It's like the microbes didn't want it. Why do we? Next slide, please. I hope I'm not yelling. So I'm going to give you some examples of what we've learned from studying different illnesses and the role of the microbiome. One of the most powerful lessons is C. difficile colitis. We originally called it pseudomembranous colitis because it has this icky kind of membrane on the surface of your colon. People die from this. They realized that it was due to this overgrowth of this one anaerobic bacteria that should be there in small amounts and in a balance. And that if somebody got this infection, and I have to say, these infections occur in every hospital. And the point is, how do you treat these infections? More antibiotics. And it would turn out that a major percentage would be refractory to all treatment. The next slide. And so this is actually how C. difficile colitis works. Look at panel A at left. You just have some of these bacteria. They have spores, which means that it's hard to kill them. And if they don't have any competition, they'll outgrow everything else because we've killed all the other bacteria with antibiotics. And what will ultimately happen is this happy at the bottom line of epithelial cells, that it's the gut barrier, starts to be eroded, and the contents within inside your intestine starts leaking into your body and makes you very sick. And this is the leaky gut. So we've learned a lot about the leaky gut from the study of this extreme disease, pseudomembranous colitis or C. difficile colitis. It's just the name of the bacteria. Next slide. But it's really not good. And actually, one of the things that has been postulated to cause this incredible outbreak is that it turns out that a food additive that they made from some kind of mushrooms or fungi, and they found an industrial procedure that made this stuff cheap, and it's in everything that we eat and everything, even cosmetics, turns out to be the favorite food of Clostridia difficile. So we're not only removing the competition, but we're adding exactly the fertilizer to make this bacteria grow out. Next slide. It must be true as in nature. And so what they've realized is that the community is disturbed. You actually need to replace the whole community. And this is what fecal transplants are really about. And it's kind of icky at left through a scope and then a syringe full of brown fluid, which we know where it comes from. They replace your microbiome, and it can have an 80 to 90% success rate to get rid of this terrible infection. And now there are companies that are trying to figure out how to have exactly the right proportions of bacteria that can be grown in the laboratory. No chance of having a stray bacterial strain get in there that will be able to replace this. And the point is, actually, it's kind of a little ironic because now with this technology, people are then looking, what else can we treat this way? And it may not be the best approach for everything, but it's an alternative. Next slide. All right, so I think my highlighting didn't come out very well. The next most studied disease is inflammatory bowel disease, where the bowel itself is actually diseased. And we've also learned the microbiome is imbalanced in many people with obesity. And this actually changes your absorption of different nutrients and contributes to an inflammatory state. Next slide. So it's really all about balance. And this just goes to show you that, in fact, different balance of Firmicutes, which is a kind of phylum of bacteria, compared to a different anaerobe Bacteroidetes in people that are obese. So this is actually a marker of an inflammatory condition that actually changes what the balance of bacteria are within your intestine. One of the solutions may be to increase fiber in your diet, but really the answer is to have a good balance. Next slide. This is just to reduce it down for lupus. We actually think that while in health, this barrier of epithelial cells is intact and the tight junctions between each of these cells is impermeable, and you have the right balance of these very colorful looking different kinds of bacteria and shape. But we know of at least 3 or 4 different examples, including that which we study in my laboratory, where there can be outgrowth of particular bacteria, which if it's in the right proportion is not bad, but it can actually contribute to the leaky gut. That causes inflammation. Some of these bacteria do better and grow better if the host is inflamed. So it's a feed forward kind of reaction. Next slide. And this contributes to the autoimmunity in lupus as well. All right, so I'm just winding down my talk, and I'm actually setting up the next speaker, Dr. Laura Geraldina Pardilla. And let me just tell you, what can we do about the microbiome? I have to say, don't eat Big Macs. That's kind of obvious, but there are no foods that actually cause lupus that we know of or that can cure it. But I have to say everything in moderation. Nutrition is very important. Laura's going to talk more about that as well. And the right balance. Look at this, fruits, vegetables, whole grains, moderate amounts of meats, poultry, and oily fish. If these came in containers, the ingredient list for each of them would be very short. You're not going to have a lot of unknown additives and other things that might be really bad for you. Next slide. All right, so the goal is reduce inflammation, and nutrition is important for strong bones and muscles. You have to learn about your medications and know what you should be doing, if possible, to avoid the side effects. Achieve a healthy weight. And I have to say that an anti-inflammatory diet is also good for reducing the risk of heart disease. The most common cause of death and issues health-wise in the United States is heart disease, and that's actually one of the major causes of premature death in lupus as well. Next slide. All right, so I've been very fortunate that I've been able to learn about lupus and the microbiome now at NYU, and I've had support from a number of foundations. I think actually early on, the LFA gave me a grant as well. And I just want to thank the audience for joining us, and I hope that there are some take-home lessons that you'll be able to benefit from. So thanks again for inviting me.
Thank you so much. That was so fascinating. I think I could listen to you talk about the microbiome all evening if we had the time. So thank you again so much. So we do have our next speaker. We can go to the next slide. Oh, it looks like we had a couple more slides. We can go ahead to the presentation.
Too much information, sorry.
It's okay. There's so much to cover on this topic. We can go to presentation, the second presentation, and I am honored to introduce this speaker. So as Dr. Silverman mentioned, we do have Dr. Laura Geraldino Pardilla. They're not making it easy for me this evening with all of these words, but she is an assistant professor and director of lupus clinic at the Columbia University. She graduated summa cum laude from INTEC University in the Dominican Republic, and afterwards moved to New York to complete an internal medicine residency at SUNY upstate. As that was followed by a rheumatology fellowship at Columbia University, where she stayed on as a faculty member. Her areas of clinical and research interests include SLE, rheumatoid arthritis, and musculoskeletal ultrasonography, and she has been a director of the lupus clinic at CUIMC since 2010. And thank you so much for joining us, and we'll let you go ahead and get started for this evening.
Good evening, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be with you here tonight. And that was a great introduction by Dr. Silverman about, the importance of how all these things that we can do to really try to alter some of the, not just your microbiome, but in general, some other additional conditions that can come along with lupus or complications that are direct consequences from this disease. So we can start with the slides if you can. Very good. And next slide, please. So, and one of the things I wanted to start with was bringing up lupus nephritis. And next slide. I think we're just a little behind there. Okay. And the reason for this is because a lot of the considerations that we have when we're thinking about what is the proper diet, what are some of those lifestyle modifications that would be of benefit when we're living with lupus, a lot of that is derived from some of the complications of this condition, right? So lupus nephritis is really the major organ complication that we see with this condition. So it's pretty common. So we're talking about half of people with lupus get to have involvement of their kidneys, and that's what's called lupus nephritis. And with that, that inflammation that happens in the kidneys can continue to progress to the point where those kidneys stop working properly. And with that, then we start creating more health problems. So not just the issues with the kidneys, but that leads to other consequences like your blood pressure rising. So then suddenly that we have to deal with also hypertension or high blood pressure. That could also put us at risk for having more heart events, things like heart attacks, strokes, and so forth. So a lot of the considerations that we'll have when we're thinking of healthy lifestyle and diet will derive from when there's been lupus nephritis, when this has been part of the complications that we've had with this condition. Next slide. So part of the management, next slide, of lupus nephritis involve not only the medications and things that you're familiar with, like immunosuppressants, steroids, some to often blood pressure medications, whether it is to help with the protein that's leaking in the urine or with actual high blood pressures that can occur, but also dietary modifications, right? Next slide. So, and that's where we're going to dwell into more. So, living with lupus nephritis and with lupus in general, um, you know, uh, takes a whole of different aspects of that condition. So it would be, you're working with your healthcare providers, which can vary a lot from not just your rheumatologist, but kidney doctor, a nutritionist, especially, when there are certain changes that are of high impact that we want to make in that diet and need some extra help and learning about your condition, but focusing on how to address diet and exercise will become a big part of this. And just to have a healthy living and just being in our best state so that we can not only fight flares of the lupus, but some of those complications that go along with it. So next slide. So how can we eat right? So, and a lot of it here, it's specifically talking about eating right for your kidneys, but eating right for your lupus in general. And not only whether the kidneys are involved, but also whether heart disease is part of the complications. But in general, what are some of those things that we can do? So, thinking primarily of this common complications that occur with lupus, it's advised to have. There's no specific diet, but it's advised to have a balanced diet in which you favor vegetables. So you want the vegetables to be, when we're thinking of a regular plate, you want the vegetables to really occupy half or a little bit more of your plate. So predominantly there, having also your protein content and favoring white meats. So things like chicken, fish, these are the preferred proteins. So healthy proteins, lean meat are the things to favor. We want to avoid processed food. And in particular, we were talking about just, how high blood pressure could be a common complication here. So making sure that we are also watching the sodium content. So staying away from those processed foods, but also watching the sodium, low salt diet, thinking about that potential high blood pressure complication. And in general, especially when we have the kidneys also involved in this condition. When thinking of the fat content that we want to have in this diet, things to consider are that we want to favor the healthy fats because, again, going back to potential complications of cardiovascular disease, heart disease, strokes, and so forth, then the fats that we really want to favor are those healthy ones. So, what we're talking about is healthy fats like avocado, nuts, olives. So those tend to be your healthier fats. Things that you'll find there's some literature on, for example, is favoring olive oil instead of, for example, cooking with butter, and acknowledging some of those properties, anti-inflammatory properties that olive oil has, that unlike butter, as an alternative. Other things to consider would be, for example, um, having a lot of grains in your diet, keeping that balance between all these components that we have just mentioned. There's also actually recently there was a new article on having a plant-based diet, and how that could have some implications with associations with less disease activity, with better control lupus in general. Important things to keep in mind when we are mainly on a plant-based diet is that we want to make sure that then we don't have deficiencies in other things. For example, like vitamin B12. So this is a vitamin that we pretty much get from animal products. So we just have to make sure that if this is our predominant diet that we're following, then to make sure that that specific vitamin is being supplemented. If there's some concerns, could it be low or not? This is something that we can easily measure with blood work. So it's something that can be looked at. But these are some of the main considerations when we're thinking of how to keep that balance. It's not that there's this very specific diet, but it's more about recognizing what are those usual complications or usual things that can occur when living with lupus, and then how can we try to minimize the risk for those to occur. And so far this is the strongest diet recommended for this changes. Another thing that's known is in particular with vitamin D. So with when we have low levels of vitamin D, that can be associated with flares of lupus, and in general, some of that vitamin D actually comes from the sun, from sun exposure. And we know with the sensitive skin issues and rashes, then we of course are trying to avoid that sun and actually using sunblock. So it's not uncommon then that we find ourselves deficient in vitamin D. And because of that, a lot of your lupus doctors are actually checking your vitamin D when they're looking into your other markers that could indicate that the disease is active. So, and if it's low, then it's easy to supplement. Just recognizing that, because it's also associated with flares, disease activity in the lupus. And those are some of the main dietary recommendations that I have for you guys. Next slide. And last but not least, considering exercise. So we're talking about living our healthiest possible life, and how can we be in top shape so that we're ready for what could come, whether it is a flare, whether it is that now we're in need of some aggressive medications that can actually debilitate us or put us at risk for more things. And to that, the exercises, having that as part of our routine not only helps us physically but also emotionally. And as we know, stress is a risk factor for flares, for in general, for cardiovascular disease and events. Exercise could be that mediator that can help us target both things, get us into good physical shape, but also emotional good emotional state and balance. So some of the other considerations with exercise in particular is that often some of the medications we're using when the lupus is very active, in particular things like steroids, they can weaken our muscles, weaken the bones. So even more so when things are really active, we really want to have that exercise as part of our routine to avoid then further debilitation, getting more deconditioned, because it's not just that we're not feeling well, but it's actually that some of those medications that are helping us in some way with inflammation are not helping us that much, or are actually worsening the status of our muscles and bones. So something important to keep in mind there. So especially when on those strong immunosuppressants, on high doses of steroids to be up and around. So walking, swimming, stretching, yoga, any kind of exercise really that doing it, of course, in a safe environment and making sure that we're gradually increasing so that we don't really hurt ourselves. But incorporating this could become a big part of keeping us healthy and avoiding further complications as we then would get deconditioned from some of the side effects of the medications used. Next slide. So actually with that, I guess somebody else will introduce our next speaker, but I will certainly be around. So when we go for the Q&A to answer some of those questions. So thanks so much for having me here.
Perfect. Thank you so much. That was such great information. And I know that that really hit some of the questions I've seen in the Q&A as well. And as you mentioned, we will have another speaker. So we're going to have a motivational moment. And so I am super excited to introduce Ayana Doogie. She is a New York-based lupus advocate. She's a stand-up comedian, writer, and co-host of Hydroxychloroquines, a podcast on living with lupus. And it looks like she's already ready to go. So the floor is yours when you're ready.
Thank you so much. This has been extremely informative as someone living with lupus, and I'm seeing the questions in the comments. So I just wanted to share my experience. I was diagnosed with lupus on November 9th, 2012. That was 3 days after my 31st birthday. Leading up to that, I was living a vegan and plant-based life. I specify vegan and plant-based because I didn't eat meat because I just didn't like meat. So most of my diet did not consist of any of the meat substitutes. I ate a lot of vegetables, a lot of tofu, a lot of tempeh, a lot of beans. And I was living, I thought, as healthy as possible. I'd also lost 65 pounds with Weight Watchers leading up to that and was extremely active. So when I got the diagnosis, it hit me hard because I thought I was doing everything right. From there, I later went into pretty serious flares that I ended up on taking prednisone, which I'm sure you guys know, the love-hate relationship we all have with prednisone. I gained a lot of weight with that and still struggle to shake it. I've been on Celsep. Currently, I'm on Imuron and Plaquenil, as well as getting Benelista infusions. When it comes to diet, I recently started seeing, probably within the last 4 months, started seeing a dietitian to really help me figure out what works for me. I've tried so many things for my lupus. At one point, I did keto, very, very, very strict keto for 5 months. I lost a lot of weight. I had no lupus symptoms. The problem with keto for me, and probably for a lot of people, is I found it nearly impossible to maintain. And I could not imagine living a keto life my entire life. So though I got a lot of benefits from that, I just knew I wouldn't be able to stick with it. Like I said, I have been vegan before. Currently, I'm pescatarian now. I've investigated green smoothie cleanses. I've seen a lot of people on the internet saying to drink nothing but green smoothies or follow a raw diet. And I'm not sure if that would work, but I know that I personally would not be able to just maintain life, or I don't think my husband would appreciate if I was eating that kind of food all the time, because I don't know if I would be necessarily happy. It would cut into my social life and my ability to just go out and enjoy my friends and my family and just be out. So right now, the reason why I went to the dietitian was I'm trying to find a balanced way of eating. And I specifically said way of eating as opposed to diet, even though I know diet means the food that we eat, not actually being on a diet. But I'm trying to find a way of a way of eating that works for me. And not only that works for me in the short term, but it's something that I can do for the rest of my life that's going to treat my lupus. So far, what I've found is sugar is not my friend. I have I have a sugar addiction. So I'm really, really working on that. But that is something that is like almost instantaneous. Just I can feel it as soon as I eat a lot of baked goods. And sleeping is very important because if I don't get a lot of sleep, when I wake up, I make poor food choices. So those go hand in hand. And my dietitian has gotten me on a decent amount of supplements, just multivitamins, vitamin D, fish oil, turmeric, and magnesium before bed. So personally, I don't feel like there's one diet that fits everybody. As a lupus warrior of almost 10 years, I have, like I said, I've done everything from vegan, plant-based, whole food-based, keto, green smoothie cleanses, intermittent fasting, extended fasting, and now I'm with a dietitian and I am just looking for balance. So if anybody has any questions about my personal experience being a lupus warrior and any of those things that I've just covered, I will be more than happy to answer and be as transparent as possible. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us. I know that I've seen a lot of questions in the Q&A asking about, if a certain diet, whether it be keto or vegan or gluten-free, can help with those lupus symptoms. So it's nice to have a real lupus patient's perspective on that. So thank you again for joining us. And we're going to go ahead and invite all of our speakers to turn their cameras back on and unmute themselves. And we're going to come back together for a question and answers panel. I've seen a lot of questions in the Q&A and the chat. I know we don't have a ton of time, but I'd like to go ahead and try to address as many of those questions as we can. And we can go ahead and actually turn our attention to these questions. There we go. And so the first question that I'd like to hit, and I've seen a lot of different ones in a couple of different places, there's a lot of interest in the fecal transplants and their use for lupus patients, if there's any thought in them being FDA approved for treatment, especially for lupus patients that might have a lot of GI symptoms related to their lupus. Dr. Silverman, any thoughts on that?
Yes, I mean, I have to say that one of the most remarkable things about fecal transplants is that you can talk about them at cocktail parties. So, but I tried to be very cautious when I presented it, and it's kind of the thing where I will say that individuals who have had children are less reticent to talk about poop. So I like to talk about poop, but it developed because of that very specific condition, which the beauty of it is that doctors cause it. It's about antibiotics. It's something that we cause, so luckily we could figure out what to do about it. And one of the places where they learned quite a bit about it was Sloan Kettering, where in fact you need to get broad spectrum antibiotics to eradicate all of the bacteria in your intestine if you're unfortunate enough to get leukemia. And so they don't want you to actually develop, once they give you the treatment for your leukemia, they don't want you to develop an infection with your own bacteria in your body. So in fact, a hospital is a C. difficile factory. And Eric Paymer studied this. It turns out a guy that I met 25 years after I met him the first time, it turned out that he and I were house officers in our training, and then I encountered him later. Brilliant speaker talking about C. difficile colitis and what to do about it. One of the things that he figured out was what was the best community in your intestine for you, one that was eradicated by doctors being treated by the leukemia. And there are actually many cases in which people got transplants, and even though the donors were screened very, very carefully, very small proportion, might be 1 in 10,000 bacteria, might develop an infection resistant to all antibiotics. So bad things happen when you're just taking communities from one person and putting in the other. Eric Paymer was quite brilliant. He figured out how to avoid that for the most part. He actually have people before they go in for their treatments, bank their own poop in case they need it later. So, I mean, we've heard about this in other contexts, but it just goes to show you that somebody else's community may not be good for you. And as we're only learning now about the subtle imbalances that can occur in the intestine in people with lupus, people that first are diagnosed, people that have been treated with many different medications, people that have actually developed severe flares, they may have very different communities. So why would you think that a therapeutic transplant, one might be good for everyone? So I have to say that again, this is not funny, but it's sort of like the poncho approach towards fecal transplantation. One size fits all. I don't think that's going to work in lupus. And we need to learn a lot more about what it is that would be best for you before we do it. So I wouldn't be an advocate at this point. And I have to tell you also that I've heard of people that had transplants and they actually needed to get antibiotics because they, one reason or another. And the worst thing in the world is an unstable lupus patient with C. difficile colitis. Oh my God. So you say, how did we get into this mess? So I don't think it's time yet. There are scientists that are trying to figure out how to grow in a test tube the right bacteria, the right strains, ones that are the most innocuous, that also work well with others, so to speak, their fellow commensals in the sandbox. And maybe that treatment will be helpful, but we need to learn a lot more before we jump right into it.
Great, thank you. That's very informative. Another question that I've seen, and Ayana, I know that you touched upon this. I don't know if doctors, if you'd like to weigh in on this, but I have seen a lot of the questions in there where people are asking, are those certain diets helpful for lupus, managing symptoms, whether it be that keto or vegan, gluten-free. I know that Dr. Silverman, you mentioned that anti-inflammatory diet is helpful for people with heart disease, and thus probably helping lupus patients as well. But just wanted to give you guys the opportunity to weigh in any more on those specific diets.
I mean, I wouldn't be an advocate, but I would tell you that physicians have learned about vitamins and diet from people that have deficiency conditions. You don't have the right balance, you don't have the right vitamins, you can get a disease, but we don't know what the right amount is to maintain the optimal health. I can tell you, I'm a personal advocate, no kickbacks involved. I take turmeric and vitamin E every day. So works for me, Amazon or whatever corner drugstore. And I will tell you also that the part that I find perplexing is when I go into CVS, they have a whole section of probiotics, and it's not comprehensible. And there are no randomized controlled studies. I think that it's a little bit early, but the right multiple vitamin probably everybody should take. And there are some anti-inflammatory compounds that larger studies have suggested can provide benefits in general, but you don't know if it's going to be best for you. But there's no real danger in taking a little bit of vitamin E, and there's some evidence to suggest that can be helpful in the right amounts, for instance, in a multivitamin. Laura, what do you think?
Well, yeah, it's all about having a balance. There's, like I mentioned, there's no real specific diet. And from what you were mentioning with, of course, if you have a deficiency or if you have some specific condition, like if you have celiac disease, well, then you have, that's where we know that, of course, having a gluten-free diet is it's what you should do to avoid having celiac disease flares. But in lupus, what you really want to do is have that balance and think about, your kidneys can be involved. You're at greater risk for having heart disease. And then what are the measures that, help with those? So that balanced diet with your high vegetables, your highest content for your plate, then your lean meats, white meats, having your healthy fats, omega-3, your normal levels for certain vitamins, in particular vitamin D. So I think this is really the best strategy that we have at the time. And things might, of course, evolve, and we may have some more specific recommendations in the future. But I think right now that's what we know. It's recommended and it's healthy to avoid those complications.
Great, thank you. And Dr. Geraldino Perdilla, I actually have another question for you. I've seen a couple, I've tried to condense them into one, but a lot of people are asking about protein in relation to kidney health. Is it okay to have, a high protein meal maybe once a week? What about protein powders? Especially for someone that might not be consuming meat, is something like that okay? Of course, generally speaking, but I'm seeing a lot of questions looking at that protein consumption around kidney health.
Yeah, and I think some of the concerns are usually, I have a lot of people with lupus ask me about, like, but is it that I should not eat protein because I have kidney disease? But actually, with the kidney disease, you're actually losing a lot of protein. You still want to consume protein. So that part's still important. It's just about proportions, right? So we're talking about your main proportion for your meals. It's really the vegetable part, but you still need to consume those proteins, and the proteins that you would favor are those from lean meat. And if you do not consume meat, then keep in mind that you still need some protein consumption. But it's not that if the kidneys are affected, yes, they're having a hard time and they're actually losing protein. So it's still important to keep that balanced nutrition.
Great, perfect. And then I do have a question for you, Ayana. You mentioned working with a dietitian. What led you to work with that dietitian? Can you share a little bit maybe about how you connected with a dietitian or started working with one?
So I've struggled with my weight, just full transparency, since I was 10. I say my closet looks like TJ Maxx because you will find every size from 4 to 12. Um, so I really went to the dietitian for two reasons. Number one, to lose weight, and number two, to figure out, like I said, I try so many different things. If there was a diet that was actually going to help with lupus. If you go online, especially if you're on Instagram or YouTube and you Google lupus and diet, you will be bombarded and more overwhelmed than if you're trying to buy a salad spinner on Amazon. That's very specific. I just bought one yesterday. So the reason why I decided to go with the dietitian, number one, my insurance covers it. And I'm all about getting all of the bang from my buck out of my insurance. So if I can get a professional to help me that knows more than I do, why not? So that was the first thing. I went on ZocDoc and I looked through the reviews, as most of us would do. And I found someone who said she specializes in autoimmune conditions. I was still very reluctant because, especially having a podcast and being very vocal about having lupus, the amount of times people slide into my DMs on social media and tell me that they know how to cure my lupus. And it usually involves a green smoothie and nothing but green smoothies and more green smoothies. And when you're done with that green smoothie, another green smoothie. I'm always very hesitant when people say that they can get me right. But what I appreciate about this dietitian, and what I guess I would suggest if you're out there searching for one, is you find somebody that listens to you, find somebody that meets you where you're at. So if you're not someone that eats vegetables all the time, you finding somebody that tells you that you need to have 7 servings of vegetables and you're not even getting 2 in, that's not going to be helpful, because you're not going to be able to maintain that. So find somebody that meets you where you're at. For my dietitian, she made me complete a food log of just a week of what I normally ate. And then we went and assessed that and found places that I can insert more anti-inflammatory foods into. I haven't seen any weight loss. I haven't been as compliant as I would like, because I'm human and I have stress and a husband and a job and all these other things. And sometimes I turn to cookies. That's what I would recommend as far as having a dietitian. I will say she has pushed me towards eating a lot more vegetables. And now I'm starting to see that it's becoming more of a habit, which is what I wanted. She's also gotten me on supplements. And last thing I'm going to say, I have very, very, very low iron from my last blood work. My dietitian also looks at my blood work. She sends a consult note to my rheumatologist so that she gets the labs that she needs as well. So she's able to monitor some of my levels on various things. I've always had very low iron. My rheumatologist has told me that's just what happens when you have lupus. My rheumatologist has never tried to treat the low iron. My dietitian, she's like, I can treat this low iron, and we can figure out if we can do it orally, or we can figure out if you're going to eventually need iron infusions. So it's nice to have somebody that has more time to spend with me, because with the rheumatologist, I only get 20 minutes every 4 months. Whereas this dietitian, I get an hour every week, and we really get to look at the very nitty gritty of what I'm putting in my body. And I just feel like I just have more people on my team that are helping me manage it, because we all know we can't cure lupus, but yeah, I've said a lot.
No, that's perfect. And I thank you for your transparency. I know there are a lot of people attending this evening that can relate to your story, and really appreciate your honesty and sharing your perspective on that. So unfortunately, we are coming to the end of this evening. So I am going to ask one last question, and I usually ask this every Lupus and You event we have. But that question is really, I'd like each of you, if you could think of, one piece of advice or one tip you would give to someone with lupus, especially as it relates to digestive health or nutrition, what would that piece of advice be? And Laura, I'll start with you.
So I would say, like Ayana was saying, try to just do better with keeping that balanced diet one day at a time. The more you do and keep trying to work on it, it starts to become a habit after a little while. And these are things that get us a long way. So just because right now, if you don't eat any vegetables or anything like this, do not give up. Just give it a try, little by little, you'll get there.
Great, thank you. Ayana, I'll go to you next.
I know you said one, I'm going to give two. Number one, don't just omit things from your diet, because I think that you're going to eventually come back and binge on that. So don't think that you're just going to cut out donuts and cut out sugar and cut out flour, because you might go the other way. And number two, I used to be a Weight Watchers leader. And what I've learned is get good sleep. If you don't sleep, chances are you're going to be making really bad decisions when it comes to your diet. We've all not had good sleep and woken up and just ate whatever was there. We're just trying to get through the day. So sleep is very important when it comes to just being able to make wise decisions about the food that we put in our mouth.
Perfect. Yeah, so important. And last but certainly not least, Dr. Silverman.
Well, many things have been said. I don't know what else to say except that, but if you have lupus, I think that you need to develop a very good relationship with your physician, somebody you can communicate with and get advice and share what's going on in your life and how you feel. And I think that's essential. A strong relationship is a building block. And nobody actually gets treated and forced to get better. It's a team effort. So, and I have to say, I congratulate the LFA for providing this forum, because to have people that are informed that you can go and speak with and get good advice, I think is really essential. And, the internet is a wonderful thing, but there are many times you can read the wrong thing and you can not understand whether it's appropriate or understandable. I have to say, I've gotten confused about my own health from reading things on the internet. So the LFA is a great source, and it's great to have forums like this. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for attending this evening. We can go ahead and put the PowerPoint slides back up. We have just a couple for me to go through at the end. But again, thank you. It was such a great event, and we loved all of the information you all shared tonight. And it was such an honor to have you participate.